Karen thought she was cracking down on a rule breaker with too many cars until she learned the shocking truth. The man she tried to find, he wasn't just a resident, he was her landlord. Jonathan Williams wasn't the kind of man who liked to show off. Despite his wealth and success, he preferred to keep a low profile. His real estate empire spanned multiple cities, with dozens of properties under his name. But in this particular neighborhood, he wasn't just an investor, he was a resident. Jonathan had purchased a home in this quiet, picturesque suburb a few years ago, wanting a place where he could relax between business ventures. It was a peaceful community, filled with families, retirees, and professionals. The streets were lined with well-manicured lawns. Children rode their bikes in the afternoons, and neighbors greeted each other with friendly waves. But there was one thing that set Jonathan apart from most of the homeowners here: his cars. Unlike the typical two-car households in the neighborhood, Jonathan's driveway was a sight to behold. A black Lamborghini Huracan sat gleaming under the Georgia sun. Next to it, his Chevrolet Camaro ZL1 rested like a sleeping beast, its deep green paint reflecting the sky. A few feet away, a Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon stood tall, while an old-school 1970 Dodge Challenger completed the collection. To Jonathan, cars were more than just machines. They were a passion. He worked hard, so why shouldn't he enjoy the fruits of his labor? Most of the neighbors didn't mind. If anything, they admired his collection. Some even stopped by to chat about cars, asking questions about horsepower, performance, and restoration tips. But while his neighbors saw a friendly car enthusiast, one person saw a problem: Karen. As the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, Karen had strong opinions about how the neighborhood should look. She despised anything she considered unsightly, and in her eyes, Jonathan's cars were an offense. To her, the neighborhood was meant to be uniform: no flashy displays, no unnecessary vehicles, and certainly no exceptions. So when she saw Jonathan's driveway filled with cars that were too flashy for her liking, she knew exactly what she had to do. It was time to put him in his place. With a smug grin, she grabbed her clipboard and marched toward Jonathan's house. She had no idea she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Karen Whitmore took her role as HOA president very seriously. At least, that's what she told herself. In reality, she was a control freak. For years, she ruled over the neighborhood like a dictator with a clipboard, walking the streets daily, looking for violations. Mailboxes an inch too tall, lawns with a few weeds, trash cans left out a little too long. If something didn't fit her vision of the perfect community, she made sure to issue a warning, and if a homeowner dared to challenge her, the fines started rolling in. Karen loved the power. It made her feel important, like she was the guardian of the neighborhood, the final judge on what was acceptable. She had fought hard to become the HOA president, winning over the board with fake smiles and empty promises of keeping the community pristine. But her real motivation: control. So when she saw Jonathan's driveway overflowing with high-end cars, her blood boiled. Absolutely unacceptable, she muttered under her breath, arms crossed as she stared at his house from across the street. The sleek Lamborghini, the aggressive Camaro, the towering G-Wagon, they weren't just cars. To Karen, they were an act of defiance, a challenge to her authority. How does someone even need that many cars? She sneered, her nose wrinkling. This isn't some car dealership. Karen believed in uniformity. Every home should have the same neutral colors, the same neatly trimmed hedges, and most importantly, the same modest, practical vehicles. A nice Honda, maybe a Toyota Camry, that was acceptable. But a collection of luxury and sports cars? Not in her neighborhood. She marched back to her house, grabbed her violation notices, and sat at her desk, typing out a letter so fast her fingers practically smoked against the keyboard. Excessive vehicles causing visual disruption. Failure to maintain neighborhood aesthetic. Fine amount, $250 per vehicle, beyond HOA limit. With a satisfied smirk, she printed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and strutted over to Jonathan's house. She slapped the notice onto his front door and stepped back, admiring her work. That should teach him, she muttered to herself. Karen had no idea that she wasn't just picking a fight. She was about to lose everything. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood as Jonathan Williams stepped outside, coffee in hand, ready to enjoy the crisp air. But something on his front door caught his eye, a white envelope taped aggressively to the wood. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. HOA paperwork. He had seen it before, but never for himself. He peeled it off, unfolded the letter, and skimmed through the words. Within seconds, he let out a deep, amused chuckle. A fine for his own cars. Unbelievable, he muttered, shaking his head as he read the absurd claims. Violation: excessive vehicles, causing visual disruption. Fine, $250 per vehicle, exceeding HOA limit. Failure to comply will result in additional penalties and possible towing. Jonathan exhaled slowly, running a hand over his beard. He wasn't angry, not yet. More than anything, he was intrigued. He had lived in this neighborhood for years. He had seen Karen in action, marching up and down the streets, nitpicking every minor detail, issuing fines like she was a sheriff in a Wild West town. He had heard stories of how she bullied homeowners, strong-arming them into compliance. But this? Trying to fine him for parking in his own driveway. This was a whole new level of arrogance. Taking another sip of coffee, Jonathan leaned against his car, rereading the letter. He could have easily called his attorney right then and there. A single phone call, and Karen's little fine would be nothing more than a memory. But where was the fun in that? He smirked. No, he had a better idea. Instead of responding with legal action, Jonathan decided to play along. All right, Karen, let's see how far you're willing to take this. He tucked the notice into his pocket, grabbed his keys, and hopped into his Lamborghini. If Karen wanted a fight, he would give her one, but on his terms. As he pulled out of his driveway, he spotted Karen across the street, smugly watching from her porch. He gave her a polite nod. She smiled back, believing she had won. She had no idea what was coming next. Jonathan had been expecting it. After receiving the ridiculous violation notice, he knew it was only a matter of time before Karen decided to personally deliver one of her infamous lectures. And sure enough, there she was, strutting across the street in her stiff beige pantsuit, clipboard clutched in her perfectly manicured hands. Karen was on a mission. Jonathan leaned casually against his Camaro, arms crossed, watching as she approached like a general preparing for battle. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice calm. Karen didn't return the pleasantries. Instead, she tilted her chin up and narrowed her eyes. "I assume you got the notice," she said, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. Jonathan nodded, pulling the folded letter from his pocket and waving it slightly. "Oh, you mean this? Yeah, I saw it." Karen's lips tightened. "And yet, your vehicles are still here." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Where else would they be? It's my driveway." Karen scoffed, flipping through her notes. "Per HOA regulations, homeowners are limited to 2 vehicles in visible areas. Additional vehicles must be stored in garages or off-site to maintain neighborhood aesthetics." Jonathan smirked. "Interesting. And where exactly is that written?" Karen blinked. "Excuse me, the rule. You just quoted it like it was written somewhere, but I checked the HOA guidelines, and there's nothing about a 2-car limit. So, where did you get that from?" For the first time, Karen hesitated. Her grip on the clipboard tightened. "It's an unwritten rule," she finally said, her voice firm. Jonathan chuckled. "An unwritten rule? You're fining me based on something that doesn't exist in the HOA bylaws?" Karen's face twitched. She wasn't used to being questioned. "It's common sense," she snapped. "This is a family-friendly community, not some car showroom." Jonathan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He could see it now. Karen wasn't here to enforce rules. She was here to enforce her will, but she had picked the wrong man to mess with. "Listen, Karen," he said, his tone still polite, but firm. "I think we both know this fine is ridiculous, but since you seem so passionate about it, let's discuss it, officially. Let's set up an HOA hearing." Karen's smirk returned. "Fine," she said, as if she had just won a battle. Jonathan smiled back. She had no idea she was walking straight into a trap. Jonathan walked back inside his house. shutting the door with a quiet chuckle. Karen had no idea what she had just agreed to: an HOA hearing, a formal meeting where complaints were addressed, violations were discussed, and, most importantly, rules were enforced properly. Jonathan wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was setting up the perfect trap. To the plan, he sat down at his desk, pulled up the HOA bylaws on his laptop, and started digging. Within minutes, he confirmed what he already suspected. There was no two-car limit rule. Nowhere. Not in the official documents, not in any past amendments, not in any written guidelines that the HOA had sent out. Karen had made it up. Not only that, but Jonathan found other violations, not by homeowners, but by Karen herself. For years, she had been issuing fines without proper documentation, overcharging certain homeowners while ignoring the violations of her personal friends, even using HOA funds for things that had nothing to do with neighborhood maintenance. She had been operating like a queen on a throne, believing no one would ever challenge her. That was about to change. Setting the bait. The next morning, Jonathan walked his usual route through the neighborhood, chatting with a few of his neighbors. It wasn't long before he realized something. Everyone had a Karen story. One man had been fined for having a basketball hoop in his driveway, while Karen's close friend had the exact same thing with no penalty. A woman had been threatened with eviction over a small garden she planted in her front yard. Another homeowner had been forced to repaint his house because Karen decided the color was too bold. Jonathan listened carefully, taking notes. By the time he got back home, he had everything he needed. Karen thought she was going to the HOA hearing to scold him, but in reality, she was walking straight into her own downfall. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, smiling. "See you at the meeting, Karen." The HOA meetings were usually quiet affairs. A handful of homeowners, a few board members, and Karen sitting at the head of the table like a self-appointed queen. But this meeting, this was different. Word had spread through the neighborhood. People who had never attended a single HOA discussion suddenly had a vested interest in today's proceedings. The room was packed, whispers buzzing in the air like an impending storm, and in the center of it all, Karen sat smugly, tapping her pen against her clipboard. She was ready to make an example out of Jonathan. The power play. Karen cleared her throat, straightened her papers, and addressed the room. "Let's begin. We're here to discuss the continued violations of Jonathan Williams, who has repeatedly ignored HOA policies regarding vehicle limits." She turned toward Jonathan, eyes gleaming. "Mr. Williams, do you have anything to say for yourself before we proceed?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, hands folded calmly in his lap. "I do, actually," he said, his voice casual. "Before we go any further, I'd just like to clarify something." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "There's nothing to clarify. The rule is very simple." Jonathan cut her off. "Actually, that's exactly what I'd like to discuss." He reached into his folder and pulled out a printed copy of the HOA bylaws. "I took the liberty of reviewing the official guidelines, and funny enough, I couldn't find a single mention of a two-car limit." A few gasps rippled through the room. Karen's expression twitched. "Well, it's an unwritten rule." "Oh, I see." Jonathan interrupted again. "So, you're issuing fines based on rules that don't actually exist in writing?" The board members exchanged uncertain glances. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. Jonathan smiled. "I think we need to talk about that, and while we're at it, we should also discuss a few other things I found." Karen frowned. "Other things?" Jonathan pulled out a second folder. "Oh yeah, this meeting isn't just about me anymore, Karen. It's about you." The room fell silent. For the first time, Karen looked nervous. The tension in the room was palpable. Karen had walked into the meeting, fully expecting to crush Jonathan, to humiliate him in front of the board, and remind everyone who was in charge. But now, she was shifting uncomfortably in her chair as Jonathan calmly placed a thick folder of documents on the table. "Before we continue with my so-called violation," Jonathan said, flipping open the first page, "I'd like to go over a few things regarding HOA enforcement. Specifically, your enforcement, Karen." Karen forced a stiff smile. "This meeting is about your excessive vehicles, not about me." Jonathan nodded. "You're absolutely right, so let's make this quick." He turned to the HOA board. I reviewed the HOA bylaws, and there's no mention of a 2-car limit anywhere. That means Karen has been issuing fines based on personal opinion, not actual rules. A murmur spread through the room. Homeowners exchanged glances, some whispering to each other. Karen leaned forward sharply. "This is ridiculous. The rule doesn't need to be written down." "Oh, but it does," Jonathan cut in smoothly. "You can't fine people for rules that don't exist. That's not how HOA governance works." The board members glanced at each other, unease creeping into their expressions. Karen's confidence wavered, but Jonathan wasn't done. While I was looking into my fine, I stumbled across some interesting information. He slid another document forward. Over the past 5 years, Karen has issued over $20,000 in fines, most of them to specific homeowners, while letting others slide. The whispers grew louder. One man in the back muttered, "I knew it." Jonathan continued. "In fact, I found multiple instances where she ignored violations from her personal friends but fined others for the exact same thing, like the basketball hoop rule. Remember that, Mr. Davidson?" An older man in the back nodded. "I had to take mine down, but her friend across the street still has one." Karen's face turned red. This is a personal attack." Jonathan smirked. "No, Karen, this is called accountability." For the first time, the board wasn't looking at Jonathan anymore. They were looking at Karen, and the shift of power was happening fast. The room had started to feel very small for Karen. What was supposed to be a simple meeting to put Jonathan in his place had now turned into a full-blown investigation into her own misconduct. And the worst part, Jonathan wasn't yelling or getting emotional. He was calm, methodical, and precise, which made it even more terrifying. He had evidence, and the board members were paying very close attention. The fallout begins. One of the senior board members, a man named Mr. Calloway, adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. "Karen, is this true?" Karen forced a laugh, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, please. This is nothing but a smear campaign, because one homeowner doesn't like the rules." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Karen, I don't mind rules. I mind corruption." He flipped to another document. "Let's talk about fines. I found multiple cases where you charged some homeowners double for minor violations while letting your personal friends slide completely." A few gasps filled the room. Jonathan turned a page. "And then there's the issue of misallocated HOA funds. For instance, in the last 2 years, HOA money was used to pay for, let's see here, a business retreat that included a spa day and luxury dining." The room exploded with whispers. "That was an HOA event," Karen snapped. "Was it?" Jonathan asked, tilting his head. "Because I also found receipts showing that only you and your 2 closest friends attended." Karen's smirk was gone. The board members weren't looking at Jonathan anymore. They were looking at her. The turning point. Mr. Calloway set his papers down and rubbed his temples. "Karen, this is serious." Another board member, a woman named Mrs. Lively, nodded. "This doesn't look good at all." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. For the first time, she realized she was losing control. Jonathan leaned forward. "This meeting started with a discussion about my cars." He smiled. "Now, I think we need to have a much bigger conversation about the future of this HOA." Karen's face turned pale, because she knew exactly what was coming next. Karen had spent years controlling these meetings. She had silenced complaints, ignored challenges, and steamrolled any homeowner who dared to question her authority. But today, she wasn't in control anymore. The energy in the room had shifted. The board members, who once nodded along to whatever she said, were now staring at her with suspicion. The homeowners, many of whom had suffered under her leadership, were whispering amongst themselves, some even glaring in her direction. And across the table, Jonathan sat, calm and composed, his documents neatly stacked in front of him. Karen swallowed hard. She had to shut this down. Desperate defense. "All right, enough of this," she snapped, slamming her clipboard onto the table. "This entire meeting has been hijacked. We're supposed to be discussing Jonathan's violations, not entertaining ridiculous accusations." Jonathan just smiled. "I'm happy to get back to discussing my cars," he said smoothly. "But first, I think the board should decide what to do about everything else." He gestured toward the mountain of evidence sitting in front of him. Karen gritted her teeth. This is all nonsense. These are exaggerated claims meant to slander me. Jonathan tilted his head. Are they? Because everything I presented comes directly from HOA records. I didn't create these numbers, Karen. You did. Karen's face twitched. The board members were now flipping through the documents themselves, nodding grimly as they read the financial reports, the fine discrepancies, and the emails Jonathan had printed, showing clear favoritism. Mr. Calloway finally spoke. Karen, we can't ignore this. These are serious allegations. Mrs. Lively sighed, shaking her head. I think it's time we put this to a vote. Karen's stomach dropped. A vote? A vote for what? She demanded. Mrs. Lively folded her hands together. A vote on whether you should continue as HOA president. Karen's breath hitched. She had walked into this meeting thinking she was about to humiliate Jonathan, but now she was about to lose everything. Karen's face drained of color. A vote? She had run this HOA for years without anyone challenging her authority. She had crushed opposition, silenced complaints, and made homeowners too afraid to speak out. But now, she was the one on trial, the last attempt at control. This is ridiculous, Karen snapped, standing up so quickly that her chair nearly toppled over. You're all being manipulated by Jonathan. He's twisting things to make me look bad. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Karen, I didn't make you mismanage HOA funds. The room murmured in agreement. Karen ignored them. She turned to the board, eyes pleading now instead of demanding. I have given years of my life to this community, she declared. I have made sacrifices to keep this neighborhood beautiful. And now, you're all turning against me because of some homeowner who refuses to follow the rules. Mrs. Lively sighed. Aaron, this isn't just about Jonathan. We've had concerns for a while, but no one ever had enough proof to act on it. Now we do. Mr. Calloway nodded gravely. A vote is the fair thing to do. Jonathan leaned back, watching it all unfold. Karen had spent so long making everyone feel powerless. Now, for the first time, she was powerless. The moment of truth. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. All in favor of removing Karen Whitmore as HOA president, say aye. A brief silence. Then, aye, Mrs. Lively said firmly. Aye, another board member echoed. Aye. One by one, the votes came in. Karen's panic grew with each word. Her gaze darted around the room, looking for support, but there was none. Even some of her closest allies refused to meet her eyes. Finally, the last board member spoke. Aye. Mr. Calloway took a deep breath. The vote is unanimous, effective immediately. Karen Whitmore is removed as HOA president. The room erupted in whispers. Karen staggered back into her chair. She had lost. And Jonathan, he just smiled. Karen sat in stunned silence, her grip tightening around the edges of her clipboard. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She had walked into this meeting expecting to humiliate Jonathan, to fine him into submission, and remind the neighborhood who was in charge. Instead, she had been publicly stripped of her power, and it was all his fault. Desperation sets in. No, she finally blurted, shaking her head as if that could undo the decision. You can't just throw me out. This is a mistake. The board members didn't react. The decision had been made. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. Karen, you built this entire system to be untouchable. You made the rules. You enforced them unfairly, and you thought no one would ever call you out for it. Karen's face flushed red. I was just trying to keep order, she snapped, her voice rising. Without me, this neighborhood will fall apart. Mrs. Lively sighed, her voice firm but calm. Karen, this neighborhood isn't falling apart. It's just moving on, without you. The begging begins. Karen's frustration cracked into panic. She turned to the board members, her voice softer now, desperate. Please, I've been president for years. I know how to run things. If I made a few mistakes, I can fix them. Just don't do this. The board members exchanged looks. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. Karen, this isn't personal, but the evidence is overwhelming. The homeowners don't trust you anymore. It's time to step down. Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for anyone at all who might speak up for her, but there was only silence. Jonathan watched her expression shift, first to anger, then panic, and finally, resignation. Karen exhaled sharply, her hands trembling. She had lost, and there was nothing she could do about it. She stood up, her movements stiff, her face a mix of fury and humiliation. Without another word, she grabbed her clipboard, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the room. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't in charge, and for the first time ever, the neighborhood felt free. The door slammed shut behind Karen, leaving the room in stunned silence. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved. Then, like a slow-building wave, the realization set in. Karen was gone. The woman who had ruled the HOA with an iron fist for years, issuing unfair fines, bending the rules to her will, intimidating homeowners into silence, was no longer in charge. And just like that, the neighborhood could breathe again. The community set free. Jonathan sat back in his chair, watching the board members as they absorbed the gravity of what had just happened. Mrs. Lively let out a long breath, rubbing her temples. Well, that was overdue. Mr. Calloway nodded, shuffling through the documents Jonathan had provided. I can't believe we didn't look into this sooner. A voice from the back of the room cut in, an older man, one of Karen's many past victims. She made my life hell for years over the color of my shutters, and all along she was the one breaking the rules. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. A woman in the front row spoke up next. She fined me $500 because my kids left their bikes on the lawn for an hour. Another homeowner muttered, I had to replace my mailbox twice because she didn't like the style. More voices joined in. The frustration, the resentment, the years of pent-up anger, it all spilled out into the open. And with every story, it became even clearer just how much damage Karen had done. Jonathan's final move. Jonathan let the room settle before he spoke. The fines she issued, the rules she enforced unfairly, I think we all agree that needs to be addressed. The board members nodded. Jonathan pulled out one last document. I propose that we wipe every fine Karen issued in the last 5 years. If it wasn't a legitimate rule, it's gone. Homeowners who were unfairly charged should be refunded. A wave of relief washed over the room. Mr. Calloway glanced at the other board members before finally saying, let's put it to a vote. It took less than a minute. Unanimous. For the first time in years, the HOA would work for the homeowners, not against them. The vote was unanimous. Every single fine issued under Karen's reign, gone. The decision sent a shockwave through the room. Homeowners who had suffered for years under Karen's ridiculous rules could finally breathe a sigh of relief. No more unfair penalties. No more pointless restrictions. No more Karen. For the first time in a long time, the HOA was working for the people, not against them. A long overdue victory. Jonathan watched as the news sank in. One woman wiped away tears of frustration as she realized she was getting back the $800 she had been unfairly fined. A father of 3 who had been forced to repaint his house twice because Karen didn't like the color, laughed in disbelief. Another man, the same one who had been targeted over his basketball hoop, shook Jonathan's hand. I don't know how you did it, he said, shaking his head, but you just saved this entire neighborhood. Jonathan just smiled. I didn't do anything special, he said. I just stood up to a bully. Karen's shadow fades. Even though Karen was gone, her presence still loomed over the room. It was hard to believe that just an hour ago, she had been sitting at the head of this very table, dictating the lives of everyone in the neighborhood. Now, she was nothing more than a bad memory. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. We need to elect a new HOA president. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Well, Mrs. Lively said, smiling, I think we can all agree it won't be another Karen. The group laughed. For the first time in years, an HOA meeting felt like a place for solutions, not punishments. The final move. As the meeting wrapped up, Jonathan took one last look at the documents in front of him. He had won, not just for himself, but for everyone. As he walked out of the HOA office, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, his neighborhood, and now, it finally felt like home. With Karen gone and her unjust fines erased, the neighborhood felt different. For years, there had been an unspoken tension in the air. People kept their heads down, afraid to break one of Karen's ever-changing, unwritten rules. A mailbox slightly too tall, a fine, a front door painted a bold color, a violation kids playing basketball in the driveway, a complaint letter. But now, that fear was gone. The neighborhood finally felt alive again, a fresh start. Over the next few days, homeowners came together like never before. The father who had been forced to remove his basketball hoop, he put it right back up, and this time, no one came knocking with a clipboard. The woman who had been fined for her front yard garden, she planted even more flowers. In fact, several neighbors helped her, turning it into a small community project. The couple who had been forced to change their house color, they repainted it back to what they originally wanted, bold and beautiful. People no longer felt like prisoners in their own homes. And the best part, no one missed Karen, a different kind of leadership. At the next HOA meeting, a new president was elected. Someone fair, reasonable, and actually willing to listen to the community. Rules were reevaluated, unwritten laws gone, petty fines a thing of the past, HOA fees reduced. For the first time, homeowners actually felt like their voices mattered. Jonathan sat in the back of the meeting, arms crossed, watching with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a victory against Karen. This was a new beginning, Jonathan's final touch. A few days later, Jonathan walked into his driveway, looking over his collection of cars. The very same cars Karen had tried to use against him. He smirked. To celebrate, he added another one to his collection, a sleek, jet black Dodge Viper, and when he parked it in his driveway, no one said a word, no fines, no complaints, just admiring glances from his neighbors. The HOA was finally doing what it was meant to do, protect the community, not control it. And as Jonathan leaned against his new car, he knew one thing for sure. This was exactly how it should have been all along. Karen was gone, but her memory still lingered, mostly as a cautionary tale. For years, she had bullied and intimidated the homeowners, making their lives miserable with her endless fines and fabricated rules. But now, she was nothing more than a bad chapter in the neighborhood's history. Life moved on, the community thrived, and no one missed her. But as fate would have it, Jonathan's story with Karen wasn't quite over yet. A fitting encounter. One afternoon, Jonathan was out running errands, picking up a few things from a local grocery store. He was checking out, waiting for the cashier to scan his items, when he noticed something. A familiar figure 3 registers away. Karen. Except she wasn't her usual polished, power-hungry self. Her once perfectly pressed suits had been replaced with a wrinkled sweater. The usual self-righteous fire in her eyes was missing. She wasn't barking orders, wasn't demanding attention. She just looked defeated. Jonathan watched as she fumbled through her purse. Clearly flustered as the cashier repeated the total, she pulled out a small wad of crumpled bills, counting slowly, her fingers shaking. And then, Jonathan heard it. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're still short a few dollars." Karen's face turned red with humiliation. For years, she had lorded her power over others, issuing fines without mercy, financially squeezing people simply because she could. And now, she was struggling to pay for her own groceries. The final word. Jonathan grabbed his bag, heading toward the exit, but not before passing by her register. He could have said nothing, could have just walked out, but instead he stopped just for a second. Karen looked up, her face filled with embarrassment. Their eyes met. Jonathan smirked. "Nice car," he said, nodding toward the old beat-up sedan she had parked outside. Karen said nothing. She just stood there, silent as Jonathan walked away, victorious. A story worth remembering. As he drove back to his neighborhood, Jonathan smiled. Justice had been served, and the best part, Karen had done it to herself.